Thank you all for joining us today. We're very excited to be sharing with you and inviting you into a conversation around activating the power of strategic volunteer engagement for a better world. And I'm thrilled to be here with my colleagues and friends, Betsy McFarland and Dr. Sue Carter-Kale. They will have a chance to introduce themselves in just a moment, but I'll give you a little background on how this particular session came about. Really, it was inspired by our seeing the topic for the upcoming Volunteer Management Hybrid Conference, which is an event that will be happening this fall. And Betsy has a slide that she can advance to with some information about the VMHC, the Volunteer Management Hybrid Conference. It's a great experience that happens annually in October. And each year there's a different topic. And this year's topic is show us the money or show them the money. It's about empowering volunteer engagement professionals to confidently showcase the tangible financial impacts of volunteer engagement, as well as, we believe, the importance of demonstrating the need for appropriate investment in volunteer engagement. And as it happens, that's a topic that we three strangely love to talk about and spend a lot of time researching, advocating for, and exploring. So we reached out to the conference organizers and said, we'd love to be part of this in some way, maybe doing a little video. And they said, how about a whole webinar? So that's the origin of today. And we're very excited. If you're intrigued, if nothing else, we hope you'll take away some ideas and better understanding of research behind this particular topic, ways that we can share volunteer impacts that matter to funders, and inspiration and tools that you can use in initiating internal and external conversations about the importance of investing in volunteer engagement with your organization and communities at large. And if you are further inspired, that you'll consider registering for the VMHC as a host site or as a participant. So, so with that, enough about the topic and the history. Love to just give a chance. I'm going to ask Dr. Sue to just briefly introduce herself before I open the conversation. My role is kind of as moderator today. We'll turn over the first question to Betsy, but maybe Sue, you can just talk a little bit about your background and how you came to this topic.
Yes, thanks so much, Beth and Diana. Glad to be here today. So my background is I've been working in nonprofits my entire career, and my current role is as a researcher and a consultant. But one of the challenges I saw was that there weren't folks doing the kind of research that I thought would be helpful to those of us who were practitioners. So I really try to do that myself. I try to bridge practice and academia, and I do that through existing consulting as well as a blog called Volunteer Commons.
Thanks, Sue. I didn't really introduce, I work with organizations on strategic volunteer engagement as a consultant. And it was interesting for me as my work in the last almost 20 years of consulting, I've evolved my own definition of what is volunteer engagement and what in particular is strategic volunteer engagement, which is where we really want to open up the conversation. The title of this session is Activating the Power of Strategic Volunteer Engagement for a Better World. Betsy, maybe you can introduce yourself and then share with us a little bit about, help us get our terminology straight. What is strategic volunteer engagement?
Thanks, Beth. Yeah, I'd love to. It's so good to be with all of you, and thank you to Better Impact for hosting today. So I'm Betsy McFarland. I also fell into this work many decades ago, right out of college, being unsure what I wanted to do with my life. I became a volunteer, right? And that took me on a journey into animal welfare. I actually spent almost 20 years in Humane Society work. I was an executive at the Humane Society of the United States, which is now Humane World for Animals. And through that, worked a lot with organizations across the country on their volunteer engagement, among many, many other things. And it's just an area where, just from my first days of even falling into this work, recognizing that so many organizations struggle to do it well and to resource it well. And it just seemed like such an an area of need and a pain point for so many nonprofits. So about 10 years ago, I started doing consulting. My business partner and I have a company called Adisa, and we work on all kinds of strategy related work with organizations, and volunteer engagement is part of that work. So thank you for having us today. And yes, to set the stage. So what actually is strategic volunteer engagement, and how is that different from good old regular volunteer engagement, right? And for all of us, I think we just have recognized over time, and I'm sure for those of you who are on this webinar, many of you are volunteer engagement professionals yourselves, and this will hopefully resonate well with you. But again, to that point of organizations not always doing this well or recognizing the critical nature of volunteer engagement, it's really about being deliberate, being intentional, and being very mission driven. That good volunteer engagement doesn't happen by accident, by simply pulling warm bodies in and throwing work at them and hoping it all works out. It's about intentionally engaging volunteers as partners in our mission, in our work, and in our operations. And just to give you a little bit of flavor of that, we do have a handout, and we can put this in the show notes at the end, but we have a great slide or a handout that was created as part of the Initiative for Strategic Volunteer Engagement, which we'll talk in a little bit about. But recognizing some of the distinctions that organizations often don't have executive leader involvement in their volunteer engagement. It's relegated to the leader of volunteers, and so being strategic means that that executive is heavily involved and engaged in supporting and championing volunteer engagement. It's having the right staffing and the right training, the infrastructure, and really strong, important, meaningful roles that volunteers can play. Because recognizing that while we don't pay volunteers, they aren't really free. And to do this well and to be strategic, it requires having good strategy, making financial investments, and being intentional in how we activate our communities. So that's a bit of a long-winded answer, but Sue, I welcome you to, complement or add to what I have added in terms of that definition, if you would like.
I think it's really the intentionality. It's showing up that volunteer engagement is by design, not by default.
Well said.
Nice, nice. So before we move on to the next question, I'll just do a couple little housekeeping reminders. I know people were still kind of flowing in thanks to the Zoom waiting room systems. Just so you know, we have provided a PDF of these slides to Better Impact. So in a follow-up email, we believe you'll be receiving a PDF of the slides, and within a reasonable amount of time, I believe a recording of this session will be available on the Better Impact events and webinars website as well. And just a reminder, my role today is as moderator, mostly to be asking questions, but I'm not the only one who should have questions. So we really, really encourage you to add questions in the Q&A, not in the chat. It's not set for you to be able to do that through chat. So use your Q&A option at what's usually on the bottom of your screen or in your dashboard. And I'll be monitoring those. And we certainly have time at the end, but if there's a pressing question, feel free to put it in when it comes to mind, because I'll keep an eye on that and be able to ask Dr. Sue and Betsy about that. So our first question, which related to the title of our session, which is Activating the Power of Strategic Volunteer Engagement. My second question is really about why now? What makes this relevant to us at this moment, which is a moment with a lot of unprecedented circumstances, though it's been work many of us have been doing for quite some time. So Sue, is this question for you, or Betsy? Who wants to take this one?
I can start, and then I'm sure Sue will have more to add. Why now? I mean, it really is, as you can see on the slide here, kind of a perfect storm moment. We know volunteer engagement, thankfully, has made a very strong comeback as the pandemic progressed and as we are now hopefully in a post-pandemic world, because it really obviously during that time became very uncertain and there was a lot of challenge for all of us, right? And recognizing nonprofits are in a difficult space at this moment. There's a lot happening in the world, we all know that, but also there's a lot of workforce challenges, a lot of funding uncertainty right now, and a real need to build our capacity in our organizations in order to continue delivering upon our programs, our missions, and adding to that, what I was saying earlier, if we're not being strategic in our volunteer engagement, many organizations don't necessarily have the understanding, the skills, or resources to really do it well. So we're kind of in this situation where nonprofits really need this, but aren't maybe set up or aware of how to make it effective. Adding to that, while we've over the last many years, and this has been shifting over time, the expectations of the volunteers themselves is changing and evolving. As our younger volunteers are kind of coming up through the ranks and the older volunteers are maybe stepping back more, we're seeing that those younger volunteers are often more transient. People change jobs a lot more frequently than they ever did before. I mean, I think back to my mom's generation and even some of my generation, we stayed in jobs 20 years sometimes, even longer. That doesn't happen as often now. And so as a result, you can expect volunteer engagement to follow very similarly. People may not stay in the same organization in their volunteer role for 20 years. Additionally, they're looking for meaningful opportunities, but they're also wanting some flexibility. People's lifestyles are very busy. We're used to trying to juggle a lot of things at once. They want it to fit into their busy lives, yet be meaningful and take really good advantage of all the skills that they have to offer the cause that they care about. And so for all of us, it creates kind of this challenge of we need to balance what our organizations need, what volunteers are seeking, and how do we make the kind of that magic happen. So Sue, do you want to add to that in terms of what you're seeing and in terms of why this is now so important?
Yes, I think one of the things is, as Betsy's mentioned, we have so many challenges coming at our sector at once. It kind of feels like this is a particularly fraught time for nonprofits. And one of those challenges is that there have been a number of attacks on nonprofit integrity and trustworthiness. There have been podcasts and posts that are suggesting that volunteers are or that nonprofits aren't spending money wisely. There have been congressional hearings suggesting that nonprofits have gone wild. And so this is a time where we really, as a sector, need to stand up. We have historically enjoyed high levels of trust, much better than they have in the corporate and government sectors. But if we're not aware of that, if we're not really intentionally educating our volunteers about what is really happening in our nonprofits, giving them opportunities to see what that looks like firsthand, helping the community understand what actual or potential cuts might look like and what the implications are for the community. This is a time where it really behooves us to be strategic about how are we educating our volunteers and how are we inviting them into a broader conversation to tell their family and friends and coworkers and colleagues and faith-based communities about what their experiences are and how that might be countering some of the negative messages that are out there about the nonprofit sector.
Thanks. So we've covered a little bit about what is strategic volunteer engagement, why now is a particularly important time to be thinking about and sparking conversations about the benefits of strategic volunteer engagement, which in this slide we see it's this is to communicate that it's not just about having extra hands to help. It's about broadcasting our messages more widely, adding, as Sue mentioned, credibility and transparency to our organization and multiplying our resources. The dollar sign isn't about saving dollars. It's about viewing volunteers as a resource multiplier, helping introduce us to donors or in-kind donations, helping us reallocate funds towards other resources, as well as donating themselves in many cases. But none of this is new. We've known these things for a long time, and yet we're still having the same conversations. So what's been holding us back? Why are we still talking about optimist. I think we're making progress, but what's been holding us back?
Yes, we are definitely making progress. I mean, it's, it has been a bit slow going and it's an evolution, right? I guess like anything, but there are certain things that, the time is ripe now, which is the good news. And all of you who are watching today have a lot of power in how we change this. So we will arm you as we go today. But a few things that are holding us back, at least from my perspective, and I know Sue will build on it as well, are some of the things you're seeing on the screen here. Like first, is some of the mindset that there is still this perception or maybe misperception of volunteers and seeing them as free labor, extra set of hands, helpers versus strategic partners. Like we need to shift some of that narrative and begin thinking a little bit differently so that we're maximizing the powerful energy that volunteers can truly bring to our organizations. Second is, as I mentioned, that kind of the infrastructure pieces that we need to build on, that we need to have dedicated staff, we need to have the technology, we need to have the processes in place, we need to train our staff in how to work effectively with volunteers and stop siloing. We often, in so many organizations, and for many of you who are leading volunteers currently, this may resonate for you, that volunteer leaders tend to be sort of buried somewhere in the organization. They're not always sitting at the table with the executive staff, not always at the table when big decisions are being made about where the organization is going or the strategies that the organization is going to employ. And that really limits the thinking and it limits the ability to integrate volunteers effectively across an organization. And lastly, this issue of investment, which we're going to talk quite a bit about in terms of what we learned. But, as Jane Leedy Justice always says from the Leedy Foundation, when she first started looking at funding volunteer engagement, she thought, I'm going to go out and find all the other funders who fund this. And she was sadly soberingly surprised that there really weren't very many. I think it's changing a little bit, but we have a lot of work to do. And it's not because it's not important. And it's not because people don't care. It's misunderstood. And we need to advocate for it. We need to make this matter and we need to make it visible. So, yeah, Sue, do you want to pick up from there?
Yeah. So one of the takeaways from some of the research that I conducted with the Initiative for Strategic Volunteer Engagement was that volunteers are hidden in plain sight. People talked over and over about how many programs and projects and even organizations rely on volunteers and that was how the work gets done. And yet they can be sort of hidden within the organization and their contributions can be harder to see. They can unfold over time. They aren't necessarily elevated beyond the number of hours that volunteers are serving. And so it makes it difficult for people to appreciate what volunteers are doing when it's not being amplified, or when we're not doing a whole lot more than offering head counts about volunteers. The other piece I think that's holding us back is that, most organizations don't have any requirements to engage volunteers. If we want to get the work done, we're probably going to engage the community in getting that work done. But there's no funder, there's no grant requirement. In fact, one of the other pieces of the research was that many grant funders were not asking about it at all, even when they had interest in knowing about how volunteers were contributing. So there isn't anybody making us do it. And there are a whole lot of other things that we are required to do as nonprofits. And then one of the other pieces that came out of the research is that the kinds of funding, when it was available for volunteer engagement, tended to be one-time kind of capacity grants. It might be for the board or for volunteers or for, say, training for the staff to engage volunteers. But it didn't really reflect the ongoing nature, right? We have expenses for volunteer engagement day in, day out, year after year. And so the kinds of funding that seemed to be available wasn't always the kind that supported the actual reality of nonprofits on the ground.
Thank you. And friendly reminder to please use the Q&A. If you have questions, feel free to pop them in. If you have questions or brief comments that'll help move our conversation forward. Not that I have a shortage of questions, so I think I'll keep moving forward. I've alluded to this being a particularly important time to have this discussion, though it's not the first time we've been having this discussion. The work has evolved around volunteer engagement, a funding gap around volunteer engagement. So I'd love to hear a little bit about the history around these efforts to close the gap. What's some of the historical context, especially because we keep mentioning this ISVE, Initiative for Strategic Volunteer Engagement. So how did we get here, and where are we with this work on a national level in the US? But we've also had these conversations with similar organizations or similar colleagues in Canada and around the world as well. So Betsy, you want to bring us up to speed a little bit?
Happy to. I'm so glad you said it too, right? It's like this is not a new effort. And so we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us, right? We're all continuing to build on this, and there will be more built from here. We're sort of a stopgap in the road too. So there's a lot more to do in this space. But we have made some significant efforts in the last few decades in terms of professionalizing this as a true field and a movement. We have things like ALIVE, the Association for Leaders in Volunteer Engagement. That's so critically important to put us better on the same kind of scale with fundraising professionals or HR professionals. We need to recognize that we are a profession. And so many, as you see on the screen here, there have been, and this is just a couple, there have been many, many efforts in the past, but a few that stand out, like Reimagining Service, which was so critical in terms of, putting some stakes on the ground, beginning to put some research behind it, which also helped to lead to some of the work with Service Enterprise that was, developed through Points of Light and now is championed by ALIVE, to accreditate organizations who are being strategic in their volunteer engagement. And then, for some of you may recall back in 2017, which now feels like a lifetime ago, we had a national summit in Minnesota to talk about the future of the field. And out of that work came the National Alliance for Volunteer Engagement, which was an effort to, again, continue to build and bridge on the professionalism of the field. And as we went through the pandemic, which, obviously so many of us recall with maybe some disgruntledness as 2020 hit, it became actually an interesting time for kind of another initiative to emerge. We've built lots of foundational work in this space. And then in about, I think it was 2001, 2002, a number of these partners came together, those you really see on the screen here, to say, what does it look like to begin to elevate this even more? Because some of the work that we learned that came out of the summit in 2017 was this recognition that while volunteer engagement professionals see this as a professionalized field and something that needs to be championed and supported, we don't always see that at an executive level or a funding level. And we wanted to see, what would it take to shift that? What do we need to know, and what would it require to make those shifts? And part of the questions were the recognition we started to have was, well, one, we need to have a baseline. Where are we starting from? What do funders and nonprofit leaders and others think of this? We have some assumptions and we have some anecdotal evidence, but we've never really gathered hard evidence around that. And so particularly the five kind of collaborators you see on the screen, the Leedy Foundation, Lodestar Foundation, National Alliance for Volunteer Engagement, Volunteer Match, and UJA Federation of New York, came together to try to answer that question. And Sue's going to talk about the research that came out of it. And there was great research funded by a number of partners, including Leedy and Lodestar, but also Fidelity Charitable and Independence. And Independent Sector was also a partner in this work in terms of helping us with some of the surveying. So that's kind of the Initiative for Strategic Volunteer Engagement makes up many of the players that you see on this slide here. And I suppose now I could turn it to you, Sue.
Actually, if you could go back, sorry, there's a couple things I want to just clarify and a question in the Q&A. So first, just to clarify, either I heard it wrong or maybe I think you may have misstated. The years that this happened with this collaboration were 2021, 2022, not 2001, 2002.
Oh, did I say that? Sorry.
You might have, or at least that's how I heard it. So I just want to clarify, we didn't go back in time. It was around 2021 that this happened. And then Angela, hey, Angela from Delaware. Angela from Delaware says, look forward to any practical tasks and steps that each of us can take, those who are new, those who are experienced in the field. I'm going to address that briefly, and then I want to do your second part of the question, Angela. So to the first part. We are going to touch on that somewhat today, though today is also designed as a bringing up to speed and sharing research, and we'll talk a little bit about where you can get some practical steps. Tomorrow, as it so happens, I am also doing another webinar with Better Impact, and we'll share some impact slide with information on the end, specifically about how do you make the case to increase investment in volunteer engagement. So tomorrow is really about closing the gap. This is about sort of the research and background and how do you activate conversations. So we'll touch on those a little bit today, and there'll also be a recording or you can register for the one tomorrow as well. But then I think it's really interesting, your second question, which is there a different profession that has had to evolve like our profession, and how can we learn from them? So I don't have a perfect answer. I'm going to share a couple thoughts on that, though, and maybe give Sue and Betsy a chance to think as well. Also, feel free, if anyone has another comment, you can put in a question you can put in a comment in one of the questions if you have a thought about that. What that makes me think of, and I don't know that this is going to be a satisfactory answer, but what it makes me think of is how I'm going to date myself. In the 1980s and 1990s, it was a very big deal in volunteer engagement to be learning from HR. How can we professionalize volunteer engagement by learning from what human resources has done to evolve to be a legitimate profession with best practices or leading practices? So things like position descriptions became really important. At that time, it was a big deal to have contracts or agreements, commitments by volunteers. I have to say, and so, so it does make me think about looking to human resources to think about how that field may have evolved and become professionalized, and is there anything we can learn about how they also, as a field, advocated for the appropriate investment of space, funds, people to actually manage and lead a human resources strategy, a talent acquisition strategy. At the same time, in the first 20 years of the 21st century, I also began hearing the question reversed, which is what can HR learn from volunteer engagement? As employee engagement became so much more pressing, as younger employees began entering the working world and demanding and expecting that they could engage meaningfully as employees, whether that's volunteering or have other employee engagement things. HR folks were suddenly looking back at volunteer engagement saying, what can we learn from volunteer engagement? Katie Campbell was an advocate for that. And I remember we've done, or she still is, some interesting conversations around that. So I don't know, how do you mirror HR when you don't have an HR at your organization? Bummer, right? Yes, Jenny, that is a bit of a bummer. But I also think you can still learn from organizations and advocate for talent management, whether it's paid or unpaid talent or both. And Uneka says, my organization updated our volunteer description to reflect job descriptions to highlight the skills volunteers can develop by supporting us. I love that. I love that piece, that there's a development piece. So I don't know, Sue or Betsy, do you have any thoughts about fund development professionals or other professions that maybe evolved and that we could learn from and maybe address some of these issues?
Sue, do you want to?
Well, I'm just, social work has been another profession that has really been, and that's part of my training, that has been looking at establishing itself as a legitimate profession. And so I think rather than go and kind of, because I think a lot of the recommendations you made, Beth, are really valuable. How can we learn from other professions? But I'd like to just kind of shift that a little bit and also say, what is unique about us? And how do we own and embrace that without trying to reflect too much? So one of the things we've been doing to legitimize ourselves is taking on business and marketing practices. So we're always looking, how do we quantify our impact? How do we measure our impact? Rather than acknowledging that sometimes you can't see our impact and you can't count it. So what are the other ways that we are into that? So I think that it's kind of a twofold piece. What are the ways that we can learn from other professions and other roles, while still retaining what is unique and special and really a reflection of our roots and our values as organizations, so we don't lose that important piece, which is why most of us exist in the first place.
I
Yeah.
love that. And
I
it,
do too.
oh,
Yeah, I was gonna say I
And-
couldn't say it better.
yeah, and it'll be a nice lead into the research piece, but before we do that, I'm just going to share a couple other comments that I think kind of what I'll weave together a number of comments that are coming in, which is to me all have to do with getting at the table, getting at the right table. And sometimes that means inviting yourself to a table, like Wendy Johnson of Indianapolis. Fun to see you on here, Wendy. Mentions that, you know, we could join SHRM, the Society of Human Resource Managers. Doesn't mean we shouldn't join Alive or a VMPC, the Canadian one, or wherever it is, depending on where you are. But the professional association for volunteer engagement professionals. But we also have a foot in the human resources world. We could join that. We could go to that table. Just like Stu mentions, there are two in Stu's volunteer team, and they're part of the 7-member people and cultures team and everyone else in HR, which is helpful. Though we're different, Stu says, which I think is important as well. And sometimes it's about inviting leadership to your table. Maybe you're not in a people and culture team, maybe you're not on executive staff, but that doesn't mean you can't be inviting leadership into your table and into your discussions, or inviting yourself into other division or departmental meetings to be part of their conversations. That's a real tactical piece to Angela's question that we can do to, you know, think about what tables you have a seat at and how do you get invited, or just pull up a chair at those other tables so you can be part of those conversations. And I'll also add that knowing the research and being able to have some important information at your fingertips is a big piece of it. And these conversations are not just, even though we do spend a lot of time talking about it, this isn't just the world according to Betsy, Beth, and Sue sitting around chatting about it. There's actually research to back it up. Recently, Points of Light released its From Nice to Necessary report, which by and large reconfirmed or enhanced some landmark research in 2022 that Betsy mentioned by Do Good Institute, and also by the amazing Dr. Sue Carter-Kale, and you both played an instrumental part in that. So can you describe a little bit about the research efforts and what are some of the key things that we as leaders would need to know as we pull our chair up to other tables to have these conversations?
Yeah, so I think that that is part of it. And Angela, I saw your other comment too, that, you know, what's that process that other professions have gone through? And I think part of that is being able to produce more data. And I don't think it's all data. I think it has to be meaningful data, but hopefully this is just one step in the right direction. That was really a driving factor for the initiative in the first place. So there are just two things here that I want to call out. One is on the right side. That was a study done by the Do Good Institute at the University of Maryland. They did a survey of nonprofit leaders as well as funders. And what was really exciting about that, I thought, is that a lot of the questions reflected each other's. So we could compare and contrast the responses of nonprofit leaders to funders, which we don't often get. And I think a question for me, at least, and I know a number of you on the call, is just what are those funders thinking? And I had a chance to get to do that with the qualitative study. We had focus groups as well as individual interviews with a number of funders throughout the US to say, what do you think about volunteer engagement? So I'm just going to highlight a few of the top level findings here, but I encourage you to go check out those studies as well. So we'll start off with the kinds of things that the nonprofit executives were saying. The good thing is that they believe that volunteers were providing services and that they were high quality services that they wouldn't be able to offer otherwise, right? Again, we know from our roles that volunteers are often how the work gets done. And so nonprofit executives were also seeing that. And yet it's still a struggle, even with some numbers of volunteers increasing, getting the right person in the right role at the right time is still a struggle for many organizations. And so, how do we really move from a warm bodies approach to a really, engaging volunteers as strategic partners means we need to get that matching and screening part up and do it well. And yet, despite some of these challenges that they were experiencing and the need for volunteers, this wasn't something that was going into many grant requests. So nonprofit leaders were reporting that they were not, in fact, asking for funding for volunteer engagement. On the flip side, some of the high-level findings from the funder surveys were that they did see that there were a lot of benefits to engaging volunteers. However, they said, well, we're not always sure that we can achieve those benefits. So that was one thing that was coming up. And they said they're just not getting a whole lot of requests for volunteer engagement. So I'm going to dig into some of those findings a little bit more because I think they are instructive for us and get at your question, Angela, too, in terms of, how are we making the case as a field? But also this applies to us within our own organizations as well. So as we look at, what are some of the reasons that funders said, yeah, volunteer engagement is a good thing? Well, they could see benefits in 3 areas: the community, the organization or agency, as well as their own funder needs. So they were saying that, what, we see that when volunteer engagement goes well, we are activating, we are equipping, we are mobilizing the community to take part in solutions that they see a value in. They also saw that it could strengthen the organization overall when the community was engaged as volunteers, and that this was actually a way not only to meet the agency's goals, but the funders' goals as well, right? So if funders are trying to increase literacy or ensure seniors can live more independently, they saw these organizations and the ways they were engaging volunteers as one pathway to get there. On the flip side, and this was sort of interesting because people would start out and they'd be like, well, maybe I'm having a bad day, or perhaps I'm a little bit cynical, or I don't want to be skeptical. It was kind of this apologetic thing. I was just talking with somebody and they're like, you can't critique volunteerism. That's like critiquing puppies, right? But this is what they said. We're concerned that maybe we aren't getting good community outcomes because those volunteers might go rogue, they might not show up again. And are they really holding them to the same standards that staff are being held to? On the agency side, they said, well, we know that volunteers could do a lot of great work, but we're not sure that organizations have the capacity to engage those volunteers well. Really, that difference between plain old volunteer engagement and strategic, as Betsy was mentioning. And in addition to funders still wanting to default to programs over operations, they just were concerned that maybe this volunteer thing wasn't really going to work out. And so they were hesitant. And we know that when funders get hesitant, they tend not to be excited about taking on risk. So those were a few things that we were hearing from the interviews, as well as the surveys and focus groups we did with those groups.
Thank you. There is a really interesting conversation going on in the Q&A. So pair colleagues, we're not going off script, we're adding here. There was a really interesting question by Sarah. Is this partly a chicken and egg scenario? Do we need funders to fund strategic volunteer engagement, thus enable better measurement and impact evaluation by nonprofits? Or do we need nonprofits to measure SVE and then use that impact case to recruit investment by funders? Or is it a both and scenario?
Sue, as the researcher, I want to hear your answer first.
Well, I think it's a both and. I don't think we have I don't think we get to wait around for it because here we are. We've been waiting for a long time and it hasn't happened. That said, I think one of the things, and hopefully this kind of addresses a couple of the other things that have come up in the Q&A, when funders had a lot to say about this in our interviews and focus groups, and then I said, okay, well, what kind of data do you collect about volunteerism? And it was crickets. So what was very interesting is that there clearly was an appetite for learning more about volunteers, volunteer engagement, how that was supporting a community organization, and yet they weren't asking about it. And so I think we have to get really creative sometimes about, we're not invited to the table and nobody asked for the data. Too bad. We're going to have to figure out how do we really start thinking about, maybe that means we're putting it into grant applications and reports in the program section, right? volunteers are supporting the programs, let's make sure that people know volunteers are an important contributor to achieving this program's outcomes, for example. So I don't want to dominate, but that's just one way I think we have to kind of force the issue and make it visible, even when it isn't part of these very scripted and regimented applications.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, I'll just to kind of bring that point home, just to say, going back to the whole title of this session about, it's about a conversation. It's like sometimes we just have to start having the conversation, both with our executives and the funders, because they care and this is just not on their radar. So even if you don't have the measures and all the stories, and you can just begin having the conversation about what's possible. And I think funders will be responsive to that.
I have a great follow-up question, but I just noticed Erin, hey Erin's comment, a modest proposal. We clone Sue and have her dedicate all her time to build the data and research on this. That would be wonderful. A whole army of Dr. Sue's would be amazing. And she also is our inspiration. So maybe this is the next slide. It's also on us. While I would love an army of, oh, sorry, I thought that we must have hidden this one.
That's all right.
The point is that you all play a critical role in bridging this gap and increasing understanding. So it is on our shoulders. We need to do that as well. Though I love that idea, Erin. That would be great. But you both were talking a little bit about the metaphor that I brought up around, a seat at the table. And Shaminda had an early note regarding the earlier point on a seat at the strategic table. Expectation of having a seat at the strategic table should not always be, expecting to be invited. We need to manage up with impact reporting. That's also an option when the invitation does not come easily. So, Sue, would that kind of mirror what you're talking about, that we have to, do you have any recommendations on managing up?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things is that sometimes you actually are collecting data, and it doesn't have to be a big, beautiful, elaborate, time-consuming, expensive study. It may be that you've got some quotes from and testimonials that you can take. So thinking about, are you already included in board meetings or board reports? If not, talking to your supervisor, talking to the executive director, how can we make sure that our board members are hearing about volunteer engagement? If your role is not already on the senior leadership team, thinking about, is there a way to advocate to get there? I know that's not a flip the switch kind of thing, but thinking about, all right, then how do I make sure that our senior leadership team is hearing about this? How can I recommend ways that we integrate volunteer engagement into the strategic plan or the strategic planning process? In what ways can I amplify volunteer voices to talk about what they're seeing in the field? And that might be a way to connect in with program team as well as the fund development team, thinking about how do you proactively go to them and say, what, let's talk about the ways that we can connect our grant requests and make sure that we're talking about the contributions volunteers are making. So those are just a few ideas about the ways that we can sort of insert ourselves into the conversation. And to Erin's point, hello, Erin. Of course, that makes my heart go pitter patter to think about getting to do this all the time. But again, this is on all of us, and it's, that we see volunteer impact day in and day out, and it doesn't need to be in a spreadsheet or in a 10-page report to make it matter. So how are we communicating what we see? It's our job. We see it better than anybody else because we're at the intersection of community and nonprofit.
And Erin went on to say, in all seriousness, just to reiterate, there's non-empirical research that leaders of volunteers can do in their own work that can be powerful and move the needle. I'll also say, just because I happen to have just been at 2 different conferences with folks from Better Impact, that you and we should all rely on our technology as well to help drive dashboards and story gathering and broadening the way that we tell the story of volunteer impact, qualitative, quantitative, both. And I know that leaders of Better Impact, as well as many other technologies, are really open to figuring out how to get dashboards that are meaningful. But you as leaders of volunteers need to set aside some of the time to figure out how to tell that story, what will help tell that story, and either pull it from the tech, the software that you have, create it, engage a volunteer who might be good with data visualization to help you with that, and talk to those who run your software as well. Okay, Angela, I see another question. I'll look at that in a moment, but in the moment, at the moment, I want to at least get to what's next and what are some of the recommendations. So what's next with this walkthrough history of the research, et cetera? You alluded to it a little bit, Betsy, but why don't you just tell us a little bit about what's next with Strategic Initiative for Strategic Volunteer Engagement, and then we'll get to some recommendations.
Yeah, really quickly, just to kind of close that loop, because if you're looking for the Initiative for Strategic Volunteer Engagement, it has evolved. We sort of have begun sunsetting that as a standalone initiative. So the exciting thing is, and it was always meant to be a time-bound initiative. That's why we called it an initiative. We didn't create a new nonprofit. It was just to come together to kind of answer those questions and produce some of the research that Sue just went over. So in 2023, 2024, make sure I get my years right. We did look for a home in which to embed more of this work. There's lots of great stuff happening all over nonprofits in the US, and it's, there's so many places that could be excellent homes for it, but independent sector really stepped up and we were excited to partner with them. So the initiative kind of has morphed into to independent sector, and they're beginning to build around that. Some of you I know have been involved or inquired, been tapped by independent sector to give feedback. So we'll be seeing more from them hopefully in the coming months and years. So it's exciting to see, because ultimately it needs to not be a standalone. All nonprofits and organizations that are advocating for nonprofits need to be talking about volunteer engagement. It can't be a standalone siloed issue. It needs to be embedded in what are all the issues nonprofits are facing.
Love it. And as we move to recommendations, I'll also share a couple stories from the chat. I know we're not going to get, or from the Q&A, we're not going to get to everything, but I'll share two examples. Jenny says our CEO has these are like of self-advocacy. So it's not self-advocacy, it's advocacy for volunteer engagement, which I think is important. Our CEO, Jenny says, has a quarterly meeting with all staff, and I always ask if I can have 5 minutes to share something about the volunteer program, and every time I am the only one who is presenting with the CEO. So way to go, Jenny. You're advocating for volunteer engagement. I would say, let's call it a volunteer strategy, not just a volunteer program, because it's something that supports all of the programs of your organization, I would presume. And Angela says, I started making my own reports and gave to my boss and then my boss's boss. And recently the CEO, when he was visiting our site, she worked for a blood bank. No one ever asked me for this information. And now I'm calling it my volunteer impact report with quotes from staff and volunteers. I did a little survey on volunteer performance from the view of blood donors, and also did impact of what volunteers did, shirts sorted, and how much time staff didn't have to do what volunteers did. So, a capacity building impact report, self-generated, and neither of these professionals waited for someone to ask for it. They decided to tell the story. And I think that's a really, really big piece of it. So what are some of the other recommendations or similar recommendations that you have to address this and be able to take action to enhance strategic volunteer engagement?
Yes. Well, thank you for those examples, because that's a brilliant segue into where we're going next. And another example of how you make volunteer engagement visible and how you make volunteers and their contributions visible. So whoa, we're just screaming along in terms of time. So we'll just jump into this and I'll kind of highlight maybe some of the connections. So first and foremost, a lot of times, again, there's sort of this default to wanting to go to numbers, and we can go to the next one, Betsy. But what we heard, even from funders, who everybody thinks, oh, they only want the numbers, they only want a financial value. They wanted context for that, because after we had, a little conversation, they'd be like, what do those numbers mean? Is 1,000 hours good? Is it bad? Is that enough? Is that too many? We know sometimes that too many is a problem, too many volunteers. And so they really were interested in help us understand what those dollars, what those numbers represent. How are volunteers making contributions to the mission? How are they contributing to operations? And so you just heard a couple great examples of people who were going beyond numbers, or talking about program numbers, organizational numbers that volunteers are contributing to. So how many seniors did we serve? How many people received food boxes? How many trees were planted? Those are the kinds of things that volunteers are doing, and those are more meaningful numbers than just their head counts. And they also were interested in hearing about what are the results of all of that volunteer time. How does that support the community? How does that support the agency? How is that supporting the volunteers and the staff? So not that you have to answer all of those questions, but think about the ones that are most meaningful for your agency and help others understand how those are meaningful as well. Next, as we keep going on, we can think about how are volunteers doing more, or what can that organization do more of because volunteers are involved. So I love Susan Ellis. She said, volunteers don't save us money, they extend our budget. They also extend our mission. So volunteers help us do more as an agency than we would if we didn't have them. And so those are important kinds of things. So maybe volunteers are saving staff time, and that means that staff can start a new program or deepen or improve or enhance another program. How is it that volunteers might be helping us reach into a new community that we wouldn't have been able to because we didn't have the connections or rapport on our staff? So those are just different ways that we can think about what are volunteers doing uniquely, and then what else are volunteers doing for the organization. So they're often not just in a volunteer role. They may be helping recruit other volunteers. They might be donors. They might be serving or being cultivated to serve on the board. They might bring participants into the agency. They might be some of our very best ambassadors, talking about the work that our organization does and how important that is in the community. So those are the kinds of things that are keeping executive directors up at night. How are we bringing in money? How are we making sure our reputation is out there? How are we increasing awareness about the work that we do as an agency? And if we can connect volunteers to those kinds of things, that makes it rise a heck of a lot higher on the kinds of things senior leadership cares about. And so as we are moving forward, then I think of this really as, how do we find, just like you're doing every day, how do we find the intersection of volunteer interests and your agency and perhaps community needs? How are we also adding another bubble to that Venn diagram about how are we thinking about, okay, so funders, if you want to make sure more seniors are living independently by getting sufficient meals, and making sure somebody's checking in on them or getting rides to where they need to go. Talk about the ways volunteers are helping do all of those kinds of things. And if you're looking for a little bit more detail on some of these recommendations, you can go to the report. This is a report that you might even share if you've got a relationship with a funder already, because it has recommendations for nonprofits as well as funders. So we just sort of planted a few seeds that you can find more about in the report.
Yeah, and just so you know, that URL will redirect you to the independent sectors page on this issue. And if you scroll down on that page, this Activating the Power Strategic Volunteer Engagement report is one of the links there. So you can just download a copy to share.
And Betsy, if you fast forward to the Q&A, I will just highlight a couple comments and really helpful resources as well, and then we'll have a couple minutes left for other questions. Sarah from Pasco County in Florida says, we use the same wording as we're a municipality and always run into concerns with union position issues. I think this is in response to your quote from Susan Ellis, the late Susan Ellis, by saying in Pasco County, volunteers extend the reach of our staff into the community, which I think is a beautiful way to state that. Shaminda also shared a resource, which I'm excited to look into and share, Volunteer Experience Framework.ca, which seems to be a community champions community for empowered leaders and engaged volunteers. So not familiar with that, but certainly worth looking into and looks like a great resource. So I wanted to highlight that in the Q&A. And then there was a question that really, or a comment that really struck me that Thelma put in much earlier in the session about universities offering nonprofit related degrees, which can elevate the volunteer professional careers. I'm so thrilled you put that in there, Thelma, and I hope that is what you're seeing. What I tend to see is that there are nonprofit degrees and public administration degrees, but they still don't include more than perhaps one day on volunteer engagement, and it's usually about board engagement. So I'll just jump on my personal soapbox and say, if any of you are out there with connections to this, I mean, we should be paid to be able to do this, so I don't know that I want to tell you to volunteer to do it, but offer to teach classes on this, offer to provide internships or help those tracks towards nonprofit professions understand that volunteer engagement is a profession. I think it's really important, even if many of those students go into fund development or go into marketing or nonprofit program development, it's all the better if those future colleagues of ours understand what strategic volunteer engagement is and what it takes to do it well. So I love that comment, Thelma, and I hope that we can do our part in helping to bring volunteer engagement into those curricula. So with that, I'll keep looking at Q&A. Feel free to add any other questions that relate to this piece about activating conversations. What are some of the key takeaways, Sue and Betsy?
I mean, I can jump in with a couple, and Sue, please build on it. I mean, I think it's just recognizing, we want you to be intentional about it. You are the experts and you're the champions. So, start having that conversation. And I just want to say, I'm sorry, I'm kind of going off script from the slide here, but I do want to also say it doesn't have to be a big fancy report. You're hearing that some folks are doing that. It could just be a few little things. You don't have to start by spending 10 weeks creating something fancy. Just start having the conversation. And if you can't get on your to the leadership table right away, start with one of your department champions. You can start small and build, because it will start to build. This might be a shift in your organization. But again, I find most organizations, if you present it in a way that is meaningful to them and you speak their language, they will listen and they'll invite you more and more to the table once you start opening yourself up to it. So put that good mojo out in the universe and it will pay off and start to build on itself. Just recognizing too that, the funders and executives, they mean well and they care. They just need your help in telling that story and getting it what it needs. So Sue? Yeah.
I'll just +1 that given the time.
And I think, which means I think it's a great lead into we don't have to do fancy big reports, although they can be helpful. What are 1 or 2 actions you can commit to taking in the coming months to garner more support for volunteer engagement? Is it inviting yourself to a table? Is it inviting leaders to your table? Is it a report? Is it doing internal research to find out what's motivating volunteers to do the work with your organization? There are so many different ways, actions you can take to move the needle, but it isn't going to move unless we out there in the front lines, whether we're at the executive level or at the real frontline grassroots level, we need to take that action. Thank you for joining us today. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much. Take care.